a few years ago, I had to figure out what job to take to be a professor, and I had a choice between HBS, Chicago, and Wharton. All of them were wonderful places. I ended up picking Wharton, and it was certainly a big decision in my life.
Oh yeah, how did you decide that? Because I went to HBS, so
Ah.
I clearly have a dog in this race or a horse in this race. But
There's some research on something called the compromise effect, which shows that when we have multiple options, we often tend to pick things in the middle. In some sense, they feel a little safer, right? So, do I want the big, biggest, most expensive thing? Do I want the cheapest, least expensive thing, or do I want something in the middle? And so, like Goldilocks and Three Bears, we tend to stick the thing in the middle. And that was a little bit like this for me. So, HBS is a very good school, known for very being outwardly focused. Chicago is a very good school, known for being very research focused, and Wharton is a mix of the two. It's not as solely research as Chicago, and not as solely teaching and practitioner sort of HBS is, and so was a mix of those two things. So I went with the compromise option.
that sounds good. Well, it seems like things are going pretty well for you. So the reason that I wanted to have you on today, we had a listener, Spiros, out of Australia, who wrote in recently about this book, and I started researching you, and I had seen you around, but I was like, we got to get this guy on the show because you have a book out, Magic Words, which is all about words. And I've been thinking out words a lot because you know what I've been doing? I've been playing with Chat GPT,
Yeah.
and it's all about the prompt, right? And so it's like formulating the right questions, thinking about words, convincing this bot that you have an interesting question. It's going to be the future to some degree. So we're going to talk about that a bit today, but I want to start just kind of high level with what inspired you to write this book and how is it different from your previous books?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. So, first of all, everything we do, basically everything we do, involves language in one way or another. Whether we're emailing colleagues, whether we're pitching clients, whether we're talking to spouses and partners, even our own private thoughts rely on language. But while we spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to talk about, if we're getting up and making a presentation, the topic of the presentation, the main ideas we want to communicate, we often think a lot less about the specific words that we use to communicate those ideas. Whether we're writing an email, putting together a pitch deck, or speaking, we think a lot about the ideas, not the words. And unfortunately, that's a mistake because it turns out that subtle shifts in the language we use can have a big effect on our own impact. Some very nice research, for example, shows that we add a certain word to a request and it increases the likelihood that other people say yes by around 50%. Or something as simple as rather than saying, I like a certain thing, saying I recommend that things makes others about a third more likely to take our suggestion. And even the language we leave behind, everything from the language we might write to colleagues over email to the language we might write in a loan application. Companies and organizations can use the language we leave behind to provide insight into who we are and what we might do in the future. And so there's a lot of exciting work going on in this space. And the question I really wondered is kind of, well, what are these magic words? And how by understanding these words can we all increase our impact?
I'm curious, why do you think that? What is the root cause of this emphasis on the ideas over the language? Because I think back to when you start school in the United States, and what it's like half of your day is spent just memorizing words. We take the SAT. I remember having these books of vocab. So it's not that we just ignore words. Obviously, like as kids, we're trying to accumulate as many words as possible. But you're right. Like interestingly, we don't think about these things as we get moving because it's all the ideas are where all the heat is, where all the energy is, right? What's going on there? Like what's the cause of that?
Yeah, I mean, well, think about it. Imagine you're asked to give a presentation at work about a project you've been working on. Imagine you're pitching a client on a service that you're offering, or imagine you're having a tough conversation with a friend or spouse. As we think about all those examples, often we think about what are we going to say, right? What do I want to get across? What are the main ideas I want to communicate? We don't think about which words do I want to use to say that, right? Particularly in spoken conversations. You and I are speaking to one another right now. Unless we script out everything we're going to say ahead of time, it's really hard to know exactly what words we're going to use. And even in written communication, right? When we have more time to construct and refine what to say, usually we start by focusing on that outline, right? The main ideas we want to communicate, and then we fill in the words. We don't spend as much time unless we have a lot of time thinking about the specific words to use.
Are there some people who just inherently naturally do this, so incorporate this thinking into what they do, or is it, like, and who, give us an example of somebody who you think does that well?
It's been really interesting thinking about this because I talk to some people and they go, "Oh, you're writing a book on language. I have this friend that's such a great speaker. Every time they talk, everybody listens." Or, oh, someone will say, "Man, I wish I was a better writer. I know so and they're an amazing writer. And every time they write something, I just want to read what they have to say." I think we have this intuition that, being a good speaker, being a good writer is something that you're born with. You
Hmm.
either have it or you don't. But what I found is so interesting is, if we understand the science, why language works, how language works, we can all become more effective writers and speakers. And I think we don't think of ourselves as writers and speakers because that's not what we do, right? We don't get up on a stage, most of us, and talk to tens of thousands of people. We don't write books or plays or movies, but we're all writers. I mean, we're constantly writing emails and presentations and content, and we're all speakers. Whether we get up on stage or not, we are speaking in a meeting, we are speaking at the dinner table, we are talking on the phone. And so, by understanding how language works, whether or not this is our full time job or just something we do as part of our job, we can all do it better.
All right, so let's get into it. You have this concept of magic words. So let's define that. And what is that really? What are you pointing to when you use that expression?
Yeah, well, so there are six types of language that I talk about in the book, and I put them in a framework called the Speak framework to help folks remember it. The S is the language of similarity and difference. The
Mm.
P is the language of posing questions. The E is the language of emotion. The A is the language of agency and identity. The first C is the language of confidence, and the second C is the language of concreteness. And if you're sitting there going, "Well, wait a second, speak doesn't end with two C's, it ends with a K," you're exactly right. It does end with a K. I couldn't come up with a better way to stuff these six things into a framework, so we're stuck with speak with two C's. But I'll give you an example of one example of magic words to help us think about it. And it comes from the agency and identity chapter, the A in that word speak. And so a number of years ago, some researchers were interested in how we get people to do something, how we get them to say yes, right? We're often asking people for help. We're often asking maybe for a nonprofit to do things like vote or take a certain action. Sometimes people do it, sometimes they don't. How could we, as requesters, get people to be more likely to help us out? Okay, so they go into a local elementary school, group of 4 and 5-year-old kids, and they ask the kids for help cleaning up the classroom. It's a mess, right? So there are books on the floor, there are crayons everywhere. It's a mess. For some kids, they say, "Hey, can you help clean up?" And for other kids, they take a slightly different approach. They say, "Hey, can you be a helper?" Now, the difference between help and helper is infinitesimally small, right? It's a couple of letters. Yet that couple of letters leads to a 30% increase in people's willingness to help. And it's not just kids in classrooms, right? We might wonder, oh, but do adults do this in real consequential decisions? Well, another study more recently looked at voting. They asked people to vote, and for some people, they sent them a note saying, "Hey, will you go vote?" For others, they sent them a note saying, "Hey, will you be a voter?" Now, again, the difference between vote and voter is quite small. In this case, it's only one letter. Yet asking people to be a voter rather than vote led to about a 15% increase in people's likelihood of turning out at the polls. And so what gives, right? Why is voter more effective than vote or helper more effective than help? And it turns out what it's all about is the difference between actions and identities. So we all know that we should do things that people ask us to do, right? We should help, we should vote, we should do all these things. But we're busy. We don't always have time to do them. What we care more about though than actions are identities, right? We care a lot about seeming smart and competent and knowledgeable. And so when actions are opportunities for us to claim desired identities, well, we're much more likely to take those actions, right? Helping, sure, I know I should, but if helping is an opportunity to be a helper, well, now I'm more likely to do it. Similarly, if voting is fine, but if it's an opportunity to be a voter, a desirable identity that I know I want to have, I'm more likely to do it. And so by turning actions into identities, we can make people more likely to take those actions in the first place.
Oh, that's very smart. I like this. This is what it makes me think of, and I hate to do this because it's so predictable, but there's a FOMO element to this. You think about it, it's because you're creating a group of people who are taking part in an activity. Everybody's doing something together. Is that herd behavior, or at least you're positing that there's a herd behavior. Here's a thing that people are doing. Do you want to be part of it or not? And then the person has to make a decision. Well, of course I want to be a helper because being a helper is what good people do. So there's this
Yeah.
interest. That's very, I mean, it's just a really easy way for me to remember it because of course I think about everything in terms of FOMO. So that's just my lazy way of doing things. But that, so you can, you can really use that. I mean, not just with 5-year-olds, but really with anybody in terms of thinking about how you're putting them. What is your place in this world, right? It's like what team do you want to be on?
Yes, I like that. I like that phrase. What team do you want to be on a lot? I think we often think about language or words as ways to sort of communicate identity, but
Mm,
sorry, communicate information, but they also communicate what it means to do something, right? Take something as simple as running. So imagine I tell you about two people. One runs. I have a friend who runs, and another who is a runner. If you had to guess, which of those people runs more often? The one who runs or who is a runner?
definitely is a runner.
Right, because it sounds like a consistent part of who they are. It's not just something
Mm.
they do once in a while, it's part of their identity, right? It's more likely to persist. And so, if we say, okay, well, I'm a hard working person, okay, I'm hardworking, I'm a hard worker, that sounds more persistent. I'm creative, I make content, okay, I'm a creator, well, that sounds like a full time job, right? And so, by shifting from kind of actions or adjectives into identities, it seems much more permanent and it can motivate ourselves as well as others, right? If I want to run more often, if I start describing myself as a runner, well, man, I really got to go out there and do it. Otherwise, I can't call myself that. And so, by shifting the way we talk to both ourselves and to others, we can change what it means to engage in a particular action and how likely we and others are to do that action.
Wow. I don't know, but Jonah, have you heard of this book, Life is in the Transitions by Bruce Feiler?
I don't know if I have.
You should check it out. It was a
Okay.
really successful book that came out during the pandemic, and Bruce is fantastic. But one of the things he talks about, and we talked about this with a bunch of guests, but the fact that everybody has their own personal narrative that runs in their life, and that sort of
Yes.
orders their life. And when you lose the narrative, when you lose the story because you lose your job or you break up your spouse or whatever that thing is, when that story becomes untenable, we have to retell ourselves a story. And what I hear and what you're saying is, like, if you can get people to integrate what you are trying to convince them to do into their own personal narrative, it's gonna be a heck of a lot easier to move them off of the block or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, right? If I'm sitting there going, okay, do I want to vote or do I want to help? That's just a one off thing.
Mm,
But if I'm sitting there going, who am I? What do people like me, that identity, tend to do? Well, if this is a thing that people like me tend to do, well, I'm much more likely to do it because it's not just voting, right?
yeah.
It's an opportunity to be who I want to be, or in some cases, avoid who I don't want to be, right? Research finds in the opposite direction. Cheating on a test is bad. Being labeled a cheater would be even worse. And so when cheating on a test in an experiment, they find, would make people a cheater, now they're less likely to do it. There's that old campaign, it doesn't say don't litter, it said don't be a litter bug. Why? Well,
Mm.
hold on, littering, yeah, okay, I shouldn't litter, but being a litter bug, hold on, I don't want to be labeled this negative identity, and so now I'm less likely to do this thing. And so it's really about making it a more stable part of who people are and how they see themselves, rather than just something that's here today and gone tomorrow.
Is there a brand that you sort of think of that does this particularly well that we can sort of point to and see how they're using this?
Yeah, I think there's some things in the book that I think are very focused on brands and what brands can do well. So,
Mm-hmm.
I've analyzed the content of various brands' social media pages and helped them figure out how to optimize content using particular words that increase engagement. In this case, I think it's less of something brands would do and more something that people would do
Mm.
on sort of in their own personal lives as a leader, as a manager, even as an employee or a parent. It's a simple trick we can use to sort of encourage others to go in the right direction.
All right, so let's move on to the next one on my list because this is the one that I really love because I think it is something that MBA students do really well, which is convey confidence. Like you
Yeah.
throw an MBA and they're like certain of everything, which I remember when I started studying, because I just wasn't raised that way. I mean, I'm from, a small town in Maine, right? Everything is there's no confidence conveying happening. But then I walked into a room of people who are 100% sure of themselves. And I remember thinking,
Yeah.
this is a superpower.
Yeah.
Talk about conveying confidence and how this plays into the system.
Yeah. So I want to talk about confidence, and to do that, I want to use a particular example. So is it okay if
Mhm.
I tell a little bit of a story?
100%.
Okay, great. So, I want to focus on a political figure, not because I want to get into politics. Everyone's entitled to believe whatever they want, but because I think it's a useful example. So take Donald Trump,
Mhm.
and whether you like Donald Trump or you hate Donald Trump, you're entitled to your opinion. you can't deny he's done a great job of motivating his audience to follow him. He's done a great job of selling his ideas, right? Getting
Hmm.
people to be on board. If you like those ideas, fantastic. If you hate those ideas, you're probably angry that he's been able to do that. But more importantly is why, right? What is he doing that gets people to go along? And so if you look at one of his speeches, for example, one of the speeches he made when he first announced his original presidential run, he said something like, America doesn't have victories anymore. We used to have victories. We don't have them anymore. If I'm elected, I'll build a great wall and I'll build it quickly and cheaply. If I'm elected, we'll beat China all the time. I beat trade deals in China all the time. And different people had different opinions about this speech. Some liked it, some didn't like it. The people who didn't like it said it was overly simplistic and bluster. And yet a year later, he's elected president. And so even if you hate Trump, which you're entitled to, or you like him, which is fine also, what is he doing right? And if you look closer, he's doing something really interesting. And he's doing something that great sales leaders do really well. He's doing something that startup founders do really well. He's doing something, as you noted, some MBA students do really well, gurus do really well. He's speaking with a great deal of confidence. And what do I mean by that? He's using language in a way that suggests that everything he's saying is right. And it's not just right, he is certain that it's right, right? It's not just, oh, America doesn't have as many victories as it used to have. America doesn't have victories anymore. He talks in absolutes, right? There's black, there's white, there's right, there's wrong, and it conveys a great deal of certainty. And not surprisingly, certainty can be quite persuasive, right? Certainty or confidence can be quite persuasive. There's some really nice research that shows when choosing financial advisors, people are more likely to pick an advisor that uses more certain or confident language. Why? Because it seems like what they're saying is more likely to be right, right? Even though that person might be overconfident or is no more likely to be accurate, they pick it because it seems like they're confident. As you said, though, contrast that with most of us, right? I'll pick on myself for a moment. I do lots of consulting projects. Someone will bring me in. They'll say, "What do you think of this strategy?" And I'll say something like, "Oh yeah, that might work," or "I think that's a decent idea," or "Yeah, that's interesting. That could happen," right? And what I'm doing is I'm using a lot of what are called hedges.
Yeah.
Might, could, possibly, I think. And while we tend to use them as crutches, right, because we're not 100% sure, we don't want to seem overconfident. Unfortunately, hedges often undermine our impact. They make us seem like we're less confident in what we're saying, and as a result, they make other people less likely to listen. And so we need to understand the language of confidence, and more importantly, how to apply it.
So here's the cognitive dissonance, and I know this is like, I'm sure you've thought a lot about this. It's sort of like, okay, great, you're right. Trump is very effective, and what's interesting, of course, is when you look at a number of the things that he says, it's pretty obvious that they're not factual. Like, it's not that they're bald-faced lies, but when you say, for example, I'm not saying he says, but he says, well, America never wins anymore. Well, I could give you plenty of examples that are wins. And so those declaratives, when we make them, when we're highly charismatic and we have a platform and stuff, then obviously the implications of saying things that are factually unverifiable is different than if you're a sort of a mid-level employee in a company and you're dealing with your boss. And I see you're nodding, so we agree with that.
Yeah.
How do you thread the needle around using this certainty in an effective way and not being completely uncredible to all the
Yes.
people around you?
Yes. Yeah. And so, first of all, let's be careful. I'm not saying that you should always
No,
speak with
for
certainty.
sure.
What I want us to realize, first of all, is that are we speaking with certainty or not? Right? I
Mm.
think many of us go, oh my God, so and so is so charismatic. How do they do it? I'll tell you how they do it. They speak with certainty, right? Now, you can sit there and go, hold on, right? I don't want to speak with certainty in this situation because I'm not so certain. And I'm not sure it's going to work out this particular way. And so I don't want to seem overconfident. Or you can say, this is a situation in which I do want to communicate certainty, but without understanding what communicates certainty, what types of language, hedges, for example, make us seem less certain. Fillers, I talk about words like definites. There are a bunch of things in this chapter, types of language I talk about. But without knowing, we can't communicate the right way. So first, I think we need to understand what certainty is. But second, as you said, we need to leverage it in the correct way, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm not sure something will work. I think something's a great strategy, but I'm not sure if it's going to work. And I'm not sure if it's going to work because I can think of some problems with that strategy. Notice there are a couple ways to say that. I can say, I'm not sure that's going to work. It might work. Or I can say something like, I think this is a great strategy. But to make this strategy work, we need to make sure these three things happen. And notice the difference there. I'm
Mm.
sounding quite confident. And I'm not sharing anything other than my opinions. And I'm indicating where the uncertainty is. We need to make sure these three things will happen to make this strategy work. But in some sense, I'm owning the uncertainty there, right? I'm being very clear about what is known and what is unknown and what we need to do to achieve the outcome I think we should achieve. Because when I just say that strategy might work, I'm actually not only indicating uncertainty, I'm being unclear. Because I have some strong opinions. I think it's a great strategy. I'm not sure it's going to work because of these three things, but if we make these three things work, I'm pretty sure it will work. Well, now I sound a lot more confident. And so owning that uncertainty and being clear where it is and calling it out can both indicate more confidence, increase persuasion, but also not seem overconfident.
I love that. I was thinking as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, like McKinsey would never say, sort of like in their deck at the end, we're not sure this will work. They will say, this will work. Here are the three considerations. And
Yes,
that's why people pay millions of dollars to McKinsey.
but they're being very clear, right? They're
Hmm.
saying if we do these three things, this will happen. Now, I can't guarantee these three things will happen. That's what we got to work on. But I'm calling out the uncertainty. I'm not just being generally uncertain. I'm calling it out. And also notice the difference between it seems versus it seems to me. Or, this might be true versus I think this might be true. When we use personal pronouns, we take ownership of the situation.
Mm.
We make it clear that, hey, I like this or I think this. There may be some uncertainty, but I'm owning that uncertainty. And doing that ownership makes us seem more certain and makes us more persuasive as a result.
Yeah. And for everybody who's listening, I'm just taking notes right now myself. It's like, these are things that you can, you can integrate these into your daily conversations in a pretty, sort of not high friction way, and you can start to see how they play out. Like, I mean, just this is like a mental shift, right? This is an aha moment where you just start to think about, how am I communicating, and just having a couple of these written down on a piece of paper on your desk
Yeah.
and integrating them, you're going to start to see, I would imagine, much more effectiveness than before.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about sticky notes on your desk. I do exactly that, right? I have a couple of reminders of sort of things I'm working on. I also find that this is much easier to see in written communication than it is in spoken communication. And so if you have a job where much of your impact is about speaking effectively, you're a salesperson, you're making speeches, it's painful, but recording one of these things, transcribing it, and reading it through is really useful. Because
Wow.
it's really easy to think, we don't use things like fillers in writing. When we're writing an email to someone, we don't say, those type of things because we get rid of them. When we're speaking, we often use a lot of fillers because we're not sure we want to say and we want to pause the conversation while we take some time to think. But those fillers make us seem uncertain and make us less persuasive. And so by recording those conversations, by transcribing them, by looking and seeing all the ums and uhs and fillers, we can take a step back and go, well, wait a second, maybe I'm not communicating the way I want to communicate. What can I do to improve
Yeah, the fillers are in written language are emoticons and lol. I mean, how many times it's like I texted my mom, who's in her 70s, and it's lol, and I'm just sort of thinking, Mom, like, what's going on here? It's kind
it?
of, so don't do that either.
Yes.
Now, I have a couple more questions for you, and we're going into a little more esoteric, but I think very valuable. The first is
Yeah.
this. So FOMO Sapiens listeners are all over the world. We've got people in every corner of the planet. And I'm curious, as you think about your work in a global context, is it always the same? Because one thing that I particularly notice in America is that we are trained from a young age to do a lot of these things. Because
Yeah.
think about it, we do show and tell at school. We take an item into school every day and we tell everybody how amazing this book about Mickey Mouse is, right? So we are sort of trained to some of these things. In other cultures, some of these things are considered to be completely anathema to what is considered good behavior. So how have you encountered, as your book has traveled the world, how has it been sort of reacted to?
There are certainly different norms in different cultures. I
Hmm.
wouldn't say Americans are better or worse at this. And I would say that the psychology is very much the same. So the words, for example, that make us seem certain or uncertain are the same across cultures. The words
Mm.
might or probably always indicates uncertainty, for example. But different cultures have different ways of communicating. I was doing something recently where somebody from Germany was talking, and they were interacting with some folks in the United States, and they said, it it was weird. I was asking someone for an interview, and I thought they said yes based on the language they used, but then I was confused
Hmm.
because I said, okay, let's schedule it, and then what they really meant was no. But they had said it in a way that I was confused because they were so sort of polite and indirect about it that I didn't actually know what they were saying. And so I think there are cultural differences in, for example, how certain we want it to seem,
Mm.
how desirable it is to seem certain, even within cultures, right? Think about, if you're the boss or, high up in a company versus if you're, a middle manager, you just joined an organization, how certain you want your language to be varies. It's not just about the United States versus a different country, it's about sort of the role you're in and the situation that you're in. And so to me, language is a tool. This book is a toolkit book. There are lots of different tools you can pull out of your toolkit, but it's about understanding when and how to use those tools effectively.
All right, context matters. And finally, so I mentioned ChatGPT earlier. It's you can't have a conversation today without talking about generative AI. It's not allowed. The metaverse is dead. It's all about it. And so the question I have for you is, I'm sure you've played around with it, and it's fascinating because it's all language based, right? And so,
Yes.
it's textual, and I read the syntax, and I'm just fascinated when you read GPT. How is it using language? Is it using language convincingly? How do you kind of look at it in your framework of magic words?
You know, I think for the moment, what it's doing is very impressive. But what it's doing is different than I think what some of us think it's doing. So it's doing a really good job of producing language effectively. Producing language in a way that feels like another person could have produced it.
Hmm.
Sorry, hold on one second.
I have the allergies too.
Oh, yeah, my
They're bad
apologies.
this year. No, you're fine.
Um, so it's doing a really good job of producing language that we don't think a machine produces, right? We ask it a question, it asks like answers like a person does. That's really
Yeah.
impressive. I'm not sure yet that it's optimized for the most impactful language, right? I think right now
Mm.
it's optimized for answering questions and doing it well. Is it going to write the best sales pitch? I don't know. And so I think we'll see as time goes on, it'll get better at that, but I don't think it's there at the moment.
All right. So if you want to find out more about Jonah's work, you can go to jonahberger.com. The book, which you've been enjoying the ideas, but go pick it up because I think this is just I've really enjoyed reading it, and I thought I was pretty good at convincing language, but I've been picking up some tips. The book is called Magic Words: What to Say to Get Your Way. Jonah Berger, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right.